everyone. My name's Terry Martin and I'm the lead for the Quantitative Method subgroup within JARUS Working Group 6. Our group focuses on using smart techniques for UAV and UTM science and helping substantiate some of the stuff within SORA. In recent times we've released a draft document for internal review, Annex F, and that's focusing on providing more detail on the ground risk determination process and mitigations. We've also been doing a bunch of work on air risk. So in today's presentation, I'm going to present a body of work for Annex F and a small teaser on some of the stuff we're doing in regards to air risk. I recognise everyone's time's precious, so I'm going to lead off with why I think you should persevere and listen to this presentation. First off, if you're from industry or you're a regulator, then this documentation and the presentation is something you need to get your head around. And I hope that you walk away thinking, I just didn't spend 40 minutes of my life listening to someone parrot process, because that's not my intent. Instead, for the newcomers amongst you, I hope you walk away with a better understanding of the basic principles of SORA compared to what you might get with just reading through. I think the 45 minutes that you spend watching this will be a wise investment, particularly if you watch it before you read the SORA and all its annexes. For the more experienced amongst you, hopefully you'll derive a better understanding of the motivation behind the work done in Annex F, and why, out of necessity, it's a suite of compromises. We within a group recognise that it's not perfect, but we'd rather iterate quickly to the point of establishing what regulator and industry pain points are and then fix them, and rather than spend an eternity take the next 5 years before you see anything. One last thing before continuing, I can't emphasize enough that this is summarizing the work done in compiling Annex F, which has only been released in draft form to Working Group 6 for review. So what you are getting represents my insight as the QM group lead, and with some redactions. It doesn't represent an official or endorsed position from Working Group 6 or JARUS, at least not yet. So please be aware that many things could change before it's officially released, but hopefully the concepts will continue. So embedded in the slide is a summary of some of the key takeaways, and hopefully I'll tease them all out, but overwhelmingly what it's been about is providing you with a transparent framework for the stuff that sits in the main body of SORA and all the annexes, and providing you with a dependency and traceability map between casualty expectation, which is obviously the minimization of, is obviously the end state, but how that traces through to the risk posed by your platform and its size and its critical area and its wingspan, and the population that you're operating over, and then how that flows through to the robustness expectations on your platform. We do a couple of things in maths to substantiate the construct within the table, and that has a double advantage in that the table, which is conservative, can, if you don't like the cell you sit in, you have recourse. We've done a couple of other things of note. Probably one of the major changes is that we no longer list a qualitative or we'll list a qualitative descriptor for population, and I'll get into that. So in the main, the document offers traceability, transparency, and significantly more flexibility. So hopefully you find the content to come interesting and enjoyable. So a little bit more about the team and what we do. Basically, there's two teams. One focuses on ground risk and the other air risk. Although moving into the future, there are a couple of additional topics which the skill set in the team may lend themselves well to, and they're pressing topics. The team members come from a diverse range of organisations, industry, academia, regulator, in some cases people with both skills or both of the latter. And without doubt there's some very smart people in the group, and it certainly results in some very sometimes heated discussions, but generally intellectually stimulating. We also work really hard, and when we do get together we enjoy socialising. Basically the ethos in the group is to deploy logic, and where appropriate prefer math over bluster. Sometimes in the social setting I think the bluster takes precedence, but in the work setting we've certainly been able to achieve a fair bit across both sub-working groups, air and ground. I did highlight that I was going to provide some background on the JARUS specific operations risk assessment for those of you who are newcomers. But even though I'm going to do that, I do feel that I need to offer up a little bit of an apology, because as we get deeper into the slides it will get a little busy, and that's primarily motivated because part of this pitch is to highlight to regulators and industry who are already well versed in it, and so I'm trying to cater for multiple audiences. So as I mentioned, a small piece offering to the newcomers. I'll provide some slides that hopefully allow you to follow along. In essence, the SORA provides guidance to an applicant who wants to conduct a particular UAV operation, and the documentation and evidence that they need to present to a regulator, what the risk will be, what the measures will be that they'll need to put in place. In the first instance, the applicant needs to describe what they want to do, details, and that includes details about their organisation and their staff, the UAV they intend to operate, and that information is then used to assess the risk to people on the ground and in the air. As you know, the QM group is primarily focused on that at the moment. What comes from that is establishing both a ground and air risk classification that subsequently leads to an assurance and integrity level score, and that then subsequently drives expectations across design, production, training, maintenance and operations. And subject to the level of risk posed by the operations, each of these elements will have more stringent expectations in the form of robustness. And basically these expectations are captured in what's termed operational safety objectives, and the risk drives the difficulty of the expectation and the level of scrutiny and checking and evidence that occurs or is required. As will become apparent, this is called robustness and is decomposed into integrity and assurance elements. One of the things that's emerged in recent times is how well SORA does at managing performance expectations for risk-based operations. So I'd just like to contrast the basic elements of SORA with a high-level safety argument for manned aviation in the form of a goal-structured network. So sitting at the top of this particular diagram is consideration for the intended operational environment, meaning that you shouldn't operate a platform in a manner that is in accordance with its design basis. Underpinning the high-level safety argument is that the systems specified and designed and constructed and operated and maintained appropriate for the environment, and that the people doing all of these things are trained, and when they do so they present suitable levels of evidence to ensure that the safety target is met, that all the assumptions are stated, and then that entire ecosystem is maintained via ongoing monitoring. Of course, this takes time and costs a lot of money, and historically the UAV community hasn't wanted to play at that particular price point. And the end result of all of that is that basically most of the approved operations are what I call the visual tether, in that, and occasionally BV loss by exception, and that's largely because there's uncertainty around how all of those key elements that I mentioned are achieved. The SORA is unique in that it offers to address this by covering off on all of those elements considered by the man community, but in a manner that is commensurate with the risk posed by the operation. In the past, some of the SORA wasn't explicitly linked to the safety targets like the man community, as you can see on the top left-hand side of the slide, but that's changing with Annex F, as well as with the work that we're doing in air risk. And so you'll see improvements what was on top of what was already a quality product. And just to emphasize this, what I've done is taken the operational safety objectives that are in Annex E of the SORA, and I've organized them into threat lines, as you can see there in red, ranging from technical through human error to the operating conditions. And what I emphasize is the similarities between this and the previous goal-structured network, because if you scrutinize the slide, you will see that elements of design and development and manufacture and maintenance and operation and training are all there. And in the background, there's performance standards in the forms of robustness that are matched and commensurate with the operational environment and the risk. And just to further or add some reinforcement to the previous slide, I include these as they are structured in the SORA Annex E, with the expectations in terms of low, medium, or high for each one of those threat lines for robustness given a particular sales score. And a little bit more of that will get fleshed out as we go. But as you can see, highlighted in yellow in the text is all of those core principles that span delivering both technical and operational airworthiness and ensuring that operations based on the principles of SORA are safe. So just for a little bit of a refresher, the ground risk process is as I've indicated there. First, you identify the intrinsic ground risk, and we'll certainly get into the details of that. And basically that's the raw risk without any attempt to mitigate anything or do anything to lower the risk, which you then mitigate in accordance with principles in the main body and one of the annexes. And the result of that is your final GRC and subsequent sale after considering air risk. That then drives the OSOs and the applicable robustness. Similarly, for air risk, basically what we have is a little bit different in that the end state doesn't come in the form of OSOs. OSOs still need to be ticked off for air risk, but there's an additional set referred to as tactical mitigation performance requirements. And sitting in between the initial air risk determination and the final air risk determination, which drives your TMPRs, is an optional set of strategic and tactical mitigations that are available to the operator. It's probably going to be a little while before I get to the air risk stuff at the end of the presentation, but just to give you an idea what the TMPRs look like, basically it's broken into three elements: performance, integrity, and assurance. So the two on the right-hand side are intuitively aligned with the acronym for SAIL, which is integrity and assurance levels. But on the left-hand side, there's an additional bit which is pertaining to performance and an expectation that the ecosystem that you have has components of detect, decide, avoid, and a feedback loop for the integrity end of town, commensurate with the level of risk posed in your either initial or final air risk classification. There's failure rates over the equipment, and similarly, the higher the risk, the more important it is to have independent third parties and competent authorities checking the evidence and the submission. So that basically summarises air risk, and for a little while now I'm going to double down and concentrate on ground risk. This slide depicts the current IGRC table that's in version 2 of the SORA. I'll just point out a couple of things. First, wingspans listed across the top of the table, and underneath that there's some guidance bands for what the nominal kinetic energy could be. But I emphasize that's guidance. And on the left-hand side are the qualitative bands for population density, i.e. shown in red, controlled, sparsely populated, populated, and gathering. And finally, for each of the population bands, there are sub-bands for visual line of sight and beyond visual line of sight flight. Given all of these metrics, you can pretty much locate what your IGRC value is, and that's used later on in the overall ground risk process. The highly observant amongst you will notice that except for the control band, VLOS operations are always one GRC value less than the BVLOS equivalent for the same population. Now, in principle, the platform causes the same damage if it hits the ground, irrespective of whether it's flying BVLOS or VLOS. So the consequence is the same, but to simplify the table and better reflect this, we've actually proposing to move VLOS to the mitigation treatments, for which basically with some nominal expectations for VLOS ops, you'll get a -1, and that will simplify the IGRC table. Okay, robustness. I've alluded to it a little bit, and I won't labour this too much. It's largely there as a slide for further review. But basically, as I mentioned, robustness is achieved by a level of integrity, which is kind of the safety gain, and level of assurance, which is how you go about proving it, and embedded in that is who checks. My simple explanation is that integrity is how tough the performance spec is, whilst assurance is who checks and how much evidence. Provided there for convenience is directions for which annex you might go to deal with which aspect of mitigation, or TMPRs or OSOs. And on the bottom right hand side there's a little map for those of you who are interested in how the low, medium and high assurance cross-correlate with integrity to get the overall robustness score. This slide kind of consolidates all of the lead-in information that I've just presented to give you a big picture, in a nutshell, concept of what's going on. So first off, you determine your IGRC and your air risk classification, shown on the left-hand side. You can then, for the ground risk, apply mitigations that are in Annex F. And emphasise that these mitigations in and of themselves, separately from the OSO, have their own robustness expectations. And that then provides you the row reference in the sail determination table that's shown in the middle there. For ARC, you can subsequently either accept the nominally allocated risk classification, and that gets punched into the SORA table, and out of that is a set of tactical mitigation performance requirements for air risk and OSOs for ground risk. There's an alternate in Annex C and D and G collectively, which allows for a combination of a somewhat murky cloud of strategic mitigations and using generalized and local densities. And at the end of the presentation, I'll allude to some of the elements in that cloud. But for the moment, we'll leave it be. And I think that gives you a fairly good overview of how the SORA works. So with the background out of the way, let's drill into the IGRC table and some of the new work that we've done within Annex F. I've already highlighted or introduced the extant version 2 SORA IGRC and emphasized the fact that we've simplified it by removing the VLOS elements and moving them into the mitigation section. What you'll observe is that migration down any particular column generally coincides with an increase of 2 GRC points with the VLOS elements taken out. So people reviewing and contrasting the tables from previous need to be mindful of that removal and how the scores migrate. So what I've got here listed is a range of questions that we had to ask ourselves as we reviewed the suitability of the GRC table and tried to substantiate the values in it. Now there was a body of background work that was done, and I'll get to that shortly, but some of the things that were raised along the way repetitively were, are the scores in the matrix translating appropriately in an observably consistent way as you vary population and wingspan / energy? Do the scores for M1, M2, M3 in the form of mitigation actually reflect their true impact on the ultimate goal that you're trying to minimize, which is casualties? And one of the things that might not be readily apparent is that in reality, wingspan and kinetic energy are a proxy for what's termed critical area, and we'll get to that. But are they actually accurate in performing that role? And finally, are the OSOs actually delivering the probability of failure that you're after in terms of the equipment reliability? So we don't fully address the last one, but we certainly do the first three, and the number 4 is on our timeline post Annex F. So just a little bit more on that first question, which partially motivated the framework we've developed and we'll get to shortly. We wanted to ensure that, for example, as you translate laterally across any particular row, the increase in the GRC score and the metrics that you're using to assess that in wingspan and kinetic energy translate in a transparent way and traceable way to the GRC scores that you get. And similarly, when you move vertically down the columns related to an increase in population, the same sort of transparency occurs in linking changes in population through to casualty expectations. And that either way you go, a 3 is a 3, and that consistently links through to your fatality rate and then subsequently drives your performance expectations. And so that's probably the nice segue, highlighting the need for a transparent linkage between population and critical area / wingspan through to casualties. And that's what underpins or motivates the selection of the formulaic framework that you can see here. So there's a couple of things embedded in it. And I also mentioned earlier in the presentation when I detailed the basic goal-structured network that for the manned aviation environment, there's generally a target or level of safety that is established and then used to maintain ongoing efforts. In our original drafting of the SORA, there was a bunch of quantitative work that was done, but wasn't necessarily collated and linked and importantly published. So our remit was to bring together all of this effort and to link it to the things we are trying to prevent, which is fatalities, and to do so in a deterministic way with the transparency between casualties, the risk posed by the combination of population and platform nastiness, and how that subsequently translates over to OSOs and robustness and in turn the allowable system failure rates. That's all delivered using the formulaic framework above, where you can see some intuitive elements like population and casualties, but with a couple of additional variables that probably require a little bit more explanation. So the first is the probability of failure, where it needs to be emphasized that this isn't at the component level, it's at the system level, encompassing all of the things that lead to a loss of control. The next term worthy of highlighting is on the far right hand side, and that can be read as the conditional likelihood of a fatality given that a collision has occurred and that was preceded by a system failure. And finally, critical area. This is going to get a little bit of a workout in the remainder of the presentation, but in very simple terms, it's the combination of the glide from 1.8 meters to the ground, and then the combination of whether it's skid, bounce, tumble with an explosion component nominally in there before coming to rest after a ground collision. Obviously, the number of people in the path will impact on fatalities, and alongside whether there's any sheltering or exposure element that might reduce those fatalities. The IGSC table makes some conservative simplifying assumptions, and I'll just emphasize that the applicant has the opportunity to unstitch some of these via mitigation with a very transparent framework now to justify and argue for that. First, we make some assumptions in that if you hit someone, it's a fatality. So that isn't always necessarily the case. Second, there's no shelter, and that everyone is fully exposed to operations, although a little later on we'll explain some elements of obstacles that was factored in and which grew commensurate with the population. So the assumption that there is no shelter is not quite true, but for the purposes of the presentation right now, we'll go with that. And finally, I'll emphasize that we align ourselves with the manned community and fix the casualty expectation to 1 by 10 to the minus 6 per flight hour. So what all of that does is allow us to simplify to three very simple things in the failure rate, in population, and in critical area. And at this point, it's worth highlighting or re-emphasizing that on the right-hand side, the population and the critical area are the two dimensions of the IGRC table. Population is intuitive, but most people won't appreciate that wingspan and energy are really just proxies for critical area because it's largely only been introduced to date in the development of Annex F. A little more on critical area. As I mentioned, critical area is a combo of the glide from the height of an average person plus the stopping distance for the aircraft when it hits the ground, with some extra buffering on either side of the aircraft, and at the end to take into consideration the dimensions of the platform. There are a number of variables that impact on this critical area, and one of the more important is glide angle, the coefficient of friction that's assumed, how much energy absorption occurs from both the ground and the platform at the point of impact, because that obviously will slow down the vehicle's momentum and kinetic energy. And the assumption that for small platforms, a collision in the skid with lower limbs by sub 1 meter platforms, may not be fatal. Now on to the first element in that formula and in the GRC, population. Just to consolidate and re-emphasize, I mentioned that the two variables on the right-hand side of the equation, population and critical area, represent the rows in population and the columns in terms of critical area, and those are linked to wingspan. Let's dig into the interpretation of population with probably the most contemporary development. an NPA put out by EASA, and of primary concern in this NPA to across many nations is the quite restrictive push towards making everything over 44 kilos or 80 joules, requiring SAIL 6, which is a form of certification, and whether it's 80 joules or 4 kilos is subject to whether it's in a populated area or an assembly, which can loosely equate to a gathering of people. And the money question in all of that is, okay, how is population for those particular categories defined? So let's dig into the NPA a little more. If you go to the NPA, it basically states that populated is defined by exclusion. So if it doesn't match the definition of a ground controlled area or sparsely populated or an assembly of people, then it's populated. So given it's a critical threshold between certification or not, we're kind of interested in what that means. So noting that assembly of people and controlled ground area need to be defined and excluded, it's fairly intuitive to recognise that the key one is where the threshold for sparsely populated lies. And if you then dig into that and go to the reference from a regional working paper that the EASA NPA quotes, you'll see that sparsely populated is if it's classified as thinly populated in accordance with that reference. And then if you dig a little deeper into the reference, it reveals that thinly populated is equate to rural areas, and then rural areas characterised by having more than 50% of the population living in rural grid cells, and then you go to rural grid cells, and they're defined as grid cells outside urban clusters. So now you're in this predicament, or not predicament, this challenge of, all right, there's another definition by exclusion. So you go to urban clusters, and they're clusters of 6 grid cells per kilometre, or contiguous grid cells in a kilometre square, with some additional caveats on the density of people and the minimum population. So I'm not sure about you, but I left that feeling a little dizzy. But you know, to be fair, this is not a phenomena that's just attributable to EASA. Even in Australia, we have some differences of opinion about what population means, and it's very difficult to dig in and find and establish what the definition for populated is. So they have a number around about 1,000 with some additional bits on density. So I expect that common theme of elements of density being embedded. Transport Canada also had something at around 1,000, although more recently I think they've updated that and reduced the number. But you contrast that with what's going on in Japan, and they've got 4,000 people per square kilometre. And then again in the US, there's differences. So what we're finding is, depending on the geography and the jurisdiction, there'll be a very different quantitative element to that metric. And since we have a commitment to have traceability between our quantitative TLS and casualties and population, we felt that placing our qualitative descriptors in the matrix wasn't in keeping with our philosophy, and importantly may lead to unsafe situations because some participants or applicants, depending on the country, may actually be having or only required to have a lower level of robustness or a poorer performing piece of equipment that wasn't commensurate with the risk. All right, now on to the dependencies and I guess the meaty part of the work, critical area and its traceability, the failure rates and casualty expectations. First off, let's take that simplified formula that I showed you earlier and rearrange it a little bit. And now the focus is on all about the system failure that leads to a loss of control. And basically, this is hardwired to the SAIL score. So The two are linked since the sales score then drives the OSOs, and because the casualty rate is fixed, which as I mentioned earlier, 1 by 10 to the minus 6, and failures and sales equate to the same thing, for any given sale, wingspan and population are negatively correlated, so one goes up, the other must go down to maintain the total level of safety and for the given failure rate. And so if you currently populate the table with all of the failure rates given the formulas and the population, some nominal population bands there and some nominal critical areas that we chose, you'll see first that linearly, as you go up diagonally, decreasing the population, you can get the same failure rate for an increased platform dimensional critical area. And similarly, if you look at the sales score, that same translatability goes straight through to the sales score. So now that we've covered off on probability of failure, what that means, and population, and the overarching goal of ensuring that the value for a GRC was consistent to tie into our high-level casualty formula, the only remaining element is wingspan and kinetic energy bands, and the need to test the assumption that they are an appropriate proxy for critical area. And that basically just flows through a couple of key questions. A, how did you calculate it? I've given you a little bit of insight into that. And what values did you choose for its variables? I'll probably withhold some of that. How good is wingspan with the kinetic energy bands at predicting the critical area? And do we need to adjust the IGRC table? And in some minor instances we did, but pleasingly, for the most part, the extant SORA was fairly consistent. We spent an inordinate amount of time working through the literature at ways that lethal area could be calculated and described, and I list many of the references there, including stuff out of the FAA, the Range Commander Council stuff, some stuff from NORCAD, a paper that was used largely to underpin the first version of the SORA, which we endearingly call the Italian Manifesto, as a shout out to collectively the authors and also Lorenzo's involvement, and some NASA papers, and then we looked at DJI papers on harm and stuff out of ashore. And inevitably what we found is that you could simplify a lot of it into a total critical area, and we call it critical area rather than lethal area, into an inert element plus an element of explosions. Now, for the moment, the SORA or Annex F does not include consideration for explosions. We leave that for the moment up to the regulator to decide on whether explosions present significantly more risk and then need to be factored in, and there's some additional work in the annex for deciding upon that, but we leave it out of the conservative element of the table. So to deal with the fact that when we were looking at all of the different techniques, what we found was that there's a bunch of different failure modes at the point of impact. They're not failure modes, progression modes, ranging from slide to bounce to splatter and to fragmentation of all of the debris. But what we generally found is in calculating that, several of the studies just calculated a basic casualty area using the aircraft dimensions and speed, and then put a multiplier in for catering for those permutations in the way that it could occur. Oftentimes they're a multiplier. We went with more of a more deterministic thing and basically bastardized a portion of what's in the Range Commander Councils and another element called a NORCAD study. What I will draw to your attention is that all of the code that we've written will be made available in both Python and MATLAB, slightly different variations in how they're implemented, because myself and Anders wrote a core portion of it. And we're going to make it freely available. What I've put there is just an allude to the various calculations and some of the things we did incorporate and the functions that were written and the variables that go into it. I'm not going to elaborate on them in any great way, but what we did find as we worked through this, that mass alone or wingspan alone or velocity alone were not particularly good when considered in isolation, and that velocity and wingspan were a better combination for predicting critical area. And as you'll see, we've gone with that. One of the more contentious variables that we had to work with was, okay, so what angle is a inbound UAV in a failure mode going to impact the ground with? And in and of itself, there are many permutations. You can have an engine off failure, you can have control flight into terrain, you can have ballistic trajectories. And so after quite a lot of effort, we settled on a 9 degrees glide angle. This is the worst case, as steeper angles, including the ballistic trajectories, inevitably come in much steeper. The skid distance always ended being shorter. But we did try some permutations with cruise speed, but at a higher angle and ballistic, and inevitably the glide speed at the low angle was the one that had consistently the longer skid distance. And what we did is we worked through and created ISO curves for each glide scenario or each scenario at the different angles, and then looked at what critical area the combination of impact speed and impact angle created. And we did that for every single platform in the band, so 1 meter, 3 meter, 8 meter, etc. And what you're seeing there is an example of ISO curves for 3 meters, and also you can see there's some velocity selections that coincide with the velocities that were ultimately chosen in the table as caps. For the most part, for example, in this particular example for the 3 meter platform, the nominal critical area without any consideration for opticals was about 200 meters. And that occurred irrespective of what angle you came in. So that was relatively pleasing in terms of our model stacked up, even in spite of some of the permutations that you would think might break it. One of the things we did to further explore how useful wingspan and energy was as a predictor for a critical area is we went and I dug up an online database released, I think it was 2016, from AAUS, and it had a mixture of about 1,000 fixed and rotary wing platforms. We then did some internet trolling and added probably another 30 from the big end of town just to supplement the data, giving us well over or nearly 1,000 platforms. And then we did a whole bunch of data analysis in and around that, basically trying to establish what the confidence limits on that data is. So could we say, for example, that with 95% confidence, all of the platforms with a particular mass sit below, or with a particular wingspan, sit below a certain mass, and that was useful for some of our kinetic energy efforts. Similarly, on the velocity front, for any given wingspan, what happens to velocity? And from all of that, we can calculate kinetic energy and a bunch of other permutations, but also look at using it to calculate critical area. And before I continue into the critical area elements, what I would like to highlight is that when you consider the confidence interval for mass in isolation or velocity in isolation, generally what you end up finding is the three-dimensional ellipsoid that might surround the 95% ellipsoid that might surround that data. is generally much smaller than the combination of each of the independent confidence intervals, as you can see with the green line there. But in any case, what we then subsequently did is use that 1,000 platform database to calculate the critical area, and then cross-compare with how well the wingspan bands were at predicting it, which was needed for us to maintain the transparency and the deterministic nature of our formula and how it all linked through to OSOs, etc. And so what you can see here is color coding reflecting critical areas of 10, 100, 1,000 meters, etc. This isn't the same as what we settled on, which was 20, 200, 2,000, at least nominally before obstacles. And but the phenomena is the same. And what you're also seeing here is the vertical planes, which represent the nominal wingspans that are currently embedded in the SORA GRC. As you can see, particularly when viewed from above, wingspan alone doesn't do a particularly good job in segregating out the critical areas, which means that you'll have some platforms potentially operating and getting OSOs for a column that it probably shouldn't. So there's basically some basic errors. There's those errors where the platforms with a larger critical area than desired are being categorized at a lower level, OSOs. And obviously, that's an obviously undesirable situation from a safety perspective. And then there are other elements where the platforms are being unjustly classified too high, and that imposes a burden on industry. And so whilst it's good from a safety perspective, it's not good from industry's perspective. So we chose to address this in a couple of ways. First, by incorporating a velocity cap in the table that significantly diminished the number of safety critical misclassifications. And then the second was to elaborate on the formula of seam and framework and give so that operators and applicants who feel that they're being unjustly pigeonholed into a GRC category where they don't belong, they have recourse now. And it's fairly translatable and usable. Now, I just emphasize that we could have improved the misclassification rate by around about 20-25% to the high 90s. But after these weren't safety critical, and that would have required a rejigging of the boundaries for wingspan, and it was felt that that would have imposed too much change on industry, many of whom have been positioning for manufacturing at particular weight and dimension categories. So this was a nice compromise that didn't actually undermine safety. So basically the outcome of all of that is the table you see now, except for the actual cell values. So you can see that we have wingspans, and we've added an extra column for platforms that are greater than 20 meters. We've incorporated velocity, so that's being swapped out for kinetic energy. And I'll just emphasize that since wingspans correlated with mass and velocity, and then with the doubling down of actually putting velocity in there, any of the errors that were introduced from kinetic energy are now gone. So this combination works better at actually predicting the critical area. And down the left-hand side, we've got some nominal population values, but they get modified, and you'll see how that's done in later slides. What we found after crunching all the maths and populating the tables is it still was quite conservative. And so we were working through trying to establish why, and one of the reasons that put forward, and we did an exhausting amount of modelling trying to substantiate this, is that as you increase the population, the number of obstacles in the form of trees and the things that people build, like houses and cars and tables and chairs and various artefacts and parks, they get in the way. So a UAV inbound as you move from the desert into urban into densely populated is going to encounter more and more obstacles. So we set about just establishing how drastically population density would impact on the actually observed critical area. So we built a conservative model and we distributed some of the obstacles, trees and chairs and various other things, gutters, according to a uniform distribution evenly across a 1 kilometre area. We put houses linearly spaced with average dimensions, and we equated that to average populations per houses, and then simulated thousands and thousands of crashes where a platform came in, projected onto this area, and where it would come to an absolute stop, except for the bigger platforms, which we didn't do this for, when it came into contact with an obstacle. And then captured all the critical areas, summarized them, built a cumulative distribution, and what the results showed that as the population density increases, the average critical area will decrease. So for example, for a population of 1,500 people per square kilometre with appropriately spaced housing and obstacles, 70% or thereabouts of the critical areas for a 3-metre wingspan were less than 120 metres. So that got factored into our table, and what you then see is a table that looks something like this in terms of how it's structured for population and for wingspan and velocity. Deliberately not showing all of the values, just a few, and they may not actually be the real values, just to give you an idea of where the population bands are and what the sales scores. What I will say is for controlled, nothing has changed, and the more astute of you may go through and try and average out where you think the numbers actually sit. Good luck with that. And you know, the motivation for me with holding the numbers is there's a lot of things, as you can see, that go into them, and some of them may come back with contention within the working group before we release it to the public. So you're getting an idea of the work that's done, but by no means have we finalised the values that will sit within that. Okay. In one of the earlier slides, I posed a couple of questions, one of which was, do the scores that are in the extent mitigation table translate in a deterministic way across the casualty expectations? For those of you who are familiar, and I'll get to it in a second, there's scores or reductions in value for the GRC table, and we wanted to check that they are actually appropriate and provide substantiation for the contribution, and you know, highlight that what we're doing, or the framework that we've proposed, does provide a more transparent basis for evaluating it. And at this point, I will emphasise that as should have become apparent as I worked through the failure rates and the linkages to sales scores, is that a -1 in GRC essentially equates to an order of magnitude. So if you get a -1 for a mitigation, what it means is that you've reduced the risk of people by a factor of 10. So you've essentially reduced the risk by 90%, and similarly a -2 represents a factor of 100. And so the regulators and applicants, in considering the worth of their proposed mitigation, need to factor this in. Let's take a look at M1, which is probably the most scrutinised mitigation amongst the three. So I'll emphasise a few things and unstitch some elements as well. Basically, M1's all about reducing the number of people at risk. So first, as an alternate, you can establish a ground risk buffer to ensure that in the event of failure, you're unlikely to crash outside your operational volume, where there may be more people. Or you could get a more accurate map and demonstrate that there are actually less people than, say, the map that you derived your population basis from via census data. Or finally, you can show that people are less exposed, or any combination of above. And as you can see by the bit highlighted in yellow in terms of the population and the exposure, you can get an idea about how that text fits in with the formulaic framework. But with this transparency, there's less ability to finesse this mitigation with BS. So those of you who are familiar with the table, getting a -2 for M1 will be a little harder, and definitely a -4 is probably getting to the bounds of near impossible. M2's a slightly different beast because the focus is on reducing the effects of the impact, and that can be achieved by a number of ways. For instance, via a parachute, or via frangible design, or where you actually reduce the critical area of the collision location. For instance, being able to stall the aircraft so that it enters a ballistic descent. And our own experimentation, as you saw, pretty much highlighted that that does act to reduce the critical area. Of course, there are robustness requirements that go with this, and they basically span your design and your procedures and your training, with the basic premise that you need a good design, but that can quickly be undermined if you don't have trained people installing the system in accordance with the manufacturer's recommendations and maintaining it also in accordance with those recommendations. And finally, the creation of an emergency response plan under M3 mitigation, which can impact on the conditional probability detailed on the right-hand side as well. I'm not going to drill into this one as much, except to say that M3 is one of those things where you can actually have your GRC increased if you don't have one, but to get a -1, that essentially means your ERP needs to be 100 times better than doing nothing, which is a challenging undertaking. This slide summarises the differences in the claimable values in mitigation from the main SORA, the extant SORA, and the newly proposed values under Annex F, or at least highlights the ones that may change with the draft. In the first instance, we've, as you're already aware, taken the VLOS operations out of the main IGRC matrix and provided a -1 option with some minor implementation requirements. So that's really, in effect, no change. The second is associated with the achievement of a -4 for a high. That's currently under debate. As there's strong evidence, the measures described in Annex B won't necessarily deliver 4 orders of magnitude reduction. So watch this space on that. But as you can see, probably the bigger change is not necessarily embedded in the actual table, but more so in the framework, and then giving both the regulators and the applicants more of an idea about the actual impact of their mitigation. Before continuing on to a little bit more on adjacent areas, I just want to highlight what I perceive as a key benefit of Annex F for those operators, particularly those operators with core competencies in safety analysis and risk analysis that may be looking to leverage SORA for more advanced operations. What the current framework now provides is a mechanism to lift yourself out of a GRC cell that's inappropriate, or if you're bordering on the corner of a cell, so to speak, because of the inbuilt conservatism that's by default built in. So now what's available to the applicant is the flexibility to link it back to a tangible and transparent framework. So there are a couple of examples that will be included in the annex about the art of the possible, but by no means are they meant to limit the possibilities. For example, if you can demonstrate that you've halved the population at risk, normally that would probably not result in an order of magnitude change, such as you are in a new GRC cell, except if you are already bordering on a population band. But you may subsequently be able to increase your allowable cruise speed without going beyond your current GRC and present an argument to the regulator to that effect. Or alternatively, you may be able to demonstrate that your aircraft has a significant reduction in dimensions, say, for example, if it sits at 1.4 meters in wingspan. And that may afford you the opportunity to fly over more people because you can highlight that you're not actually breaching the casualty expectation limit of 1 by 10 to the minus 6. Now, this is going to obviously be at the discretion of each of the NAAs, but now there's logic and math to help guide both parties. So my belief is that that's a big win for all. So I just want to close out the ground risk element by looping back to some of the background mitigation, the IGRC table, and the newly proposed formula to consider adjacent areas and to reinforce some basic principles that we've talked through. To do so, I'll draw on the combination of the semantic model and differentiate between the area used to determine the intrinsic GRC and the concept of containment. And to elaborate, that requires viewer familiarity with what the difference between flight geography, contingency volume, and operational volume and the adjacent area actually is. And so there's a diagram included from the SORA. I won't drill into the differences beyond highlighting that it should be graphically intuitive, and so hopefully you can understand what I mean. But IGRC is about capturing the risk within the combination of the operational volume and I can't emphasize this enough, and the risk buffer. What seems to occur frequently is the misconception that the population at risk in the risk buffer doesn't necessarily count. Now, there are some regulators that may entertain arguments about limited exposure at the boundaries of the risk buffer. For example, where you have a small cluster of houses that artificially inflate the population density in the risk buffer. But that is very much a discretionary item, and I wouldn't like to superimpose that within the SORA main body. So let's just see how that plays out. For the IGRC, as you know, you can apply M1 to reduce your score, but you can't just make false claim without evidence to put yourself into a final category with less robustness. You actually need to substantiate it, and that's why mitigations also simultaneously have robustness expectations. And then basically after that, that translates into a sales score. And those sales scores have their own robustness. So again, you're having to substantiate the claims all the way through. So there's a little latitude for math trickery, I guess you could say. Now, when you look at adjacent areas or containment, and whilst there for IGRC is the same area considered for containment, you also need to consider what the population density of the adjacent areas are. And just as for mitigations is different from OSOs, all the robustness measures are different from OSOs, the robustness for containment is different again. So I call them basic containment and advanced containment, and I'll just caution that that's a Terry simplicity. I highlight just my way of helping people work through what's a little confusing in the current text of the SORA, particularly for ab initio users. And if you scrutinise the text in the main body, the big difference is that the quantitative failure rate for your containment system is listed for the advanced containment, and you've got to demonstrate, and there's some extras around software and hardware assurance and making sure that there's no single points of failure in your containment efforts. Now, I've compiled for convenience and to help people's understanding of what's in the legalistic text within the SORA, a basic flow diagram, and it's all about whether the area next to you is a gathering or whether or not you're already in a populated area. And you can see that by the two streams that I've got listed there, right and left of the start sign. If you're approved to operate in a gathering, then your combination of IGRC and mitigations means you're approved to operate in the most challenging population criteria there is. So a loss of containment is not critical, and what that flows through is only an expectation for you to have basic containment. Or you could be approved to be operating in a controlled area which sits within a populated area. So the expectations under those conditions is it wasn't particularly challenging for you to get it because there's no one underfoot in terms of some of the other things you need to address. But if there's lots of people surrounding you, then you need to care about a poor containment system, and that's what the flowchart actually achieves. Now, your adjacent area status gets a little complicated for the air risk picture because operating in a controlled airspace with ADS-B and primary and secondary surveillance radar and procedural controls, and where the common operating picture for the ATC is fairly strong, is very capable of keeping you completely safe with a low-performing detect and avoid system. But unlike ground risk, you may not actually be equipped for a loss of containment because your DAA system is not suited to deal with operating in an environment where there's plenty of VFR uncooperative intruders with very little ATC support because you're in uncontrolled airspace. So that little bit may need to be cleaned up in future releases. The final thing of note in this slide is that we have highlighted that the proposed IGRC will remove qualitative references, and this is going to have some flow-through implications for containment because we'll now need to ascertain what threshold equates to the boundary between sparsely populated and gathering, and all the joy that comes with dealing with definitions. So with all of that outlined, there's still some, I guess, areas of uncertainty and outstanding questions, and I've listed some of them there. These certainly are starting to emerge with queries from regulators, and we'll be chipping away trying to answer them. And that includes how far does the definition of adjacency extend? For the moment, common sense should prevail. As a small UAS with limited range wouldn't consider in their adjacency area a busy airport or helicopter environment or a more densely populated area which is 30 kilometres away. And the other bit is that the risk buffer has three options: low, medium and high, and with a 1-to-1 ratio giving you a -1. At the moment, the risk buffer is being used as a crude proportion of what delivers you containment via the use of your flight termination system. that brings it down within the buffer, but there could be other failure modes. And so working around what the overlap between what the risk buffer is doing and what containment is doing needs to be sorted out probabilistically. And I just like to highlight, and I use it there in reference to one of the members of our group, avoiding tomfoolery, because many of the regulators on a day-to-day basis find people pitching ideas about how they can not include the risk buffer in their population determination, because often the risk buffer is has more people in it, and that would shrink their operational volume. So there's a few little corner cases that need to be dealt with, and hopefully either before Annex F comes out or beyond that, we'll fix them up. In concluding the risk element, or the ground risk element, I just want to emphasise that a significant body of work's gone into creating a transparent basis for how ground risk is determined, and obviously thank the team members within our group. By default, the matrix is a little conservative. Some would argue within the group that it's a lot conservative. But now the applicant has greater clarity on what the path to recourse may be. And there's also a lot more detail on what the value that mitigations provide are. Importantly, now regulators have more detail on the dependencies between casualties and risk in the form of population in critical area and aircraft dimensions, and how that ties through to robustness expectations. We look forward to the comments out of Working Group 6 and ultimately the public, so that we can provide everyone with a better product that helps UAV regulation keep pace with the rapid change of UAV technology. And now for air risk. And this field of endeavour is decidedly trickier. The QM group itself is only small. We have a couple of former ATCs in Peter and Bosco, although Peter has immersed himself so deeply in the QM stuff, I completely forget his background most of the time, because he basically is a quant. And of course, Aaron and myself inject an academic flavour into this, although both Aaron and I think, like to delude ourselves that we skew to the more practical side of the academic bell curve. Now, the slide shown here is 20 of the same flights flown over the course of a month in Singapore. Typically, if I pose the question to an ATC or a member of the general public, would you let UAV fly here? The answer is an emphatic no. But what about if I presented a year's worth of data and gaps could still be observed, and I could guarantee that those UAVs would not breach their operations volume because their containment expectations were exacting? What about then? And this is kind of the driver for a lot of the airspace characterization work that both Peter and Aaron have done considerable amount of work in, and which underpins what we're doing in the QM group. But the question I've posed at the moment is a bit of a moot point, because what we currently have are maps like these in facility maps. And whilst they have utility for facilitating VLOS ops around airports, there are numerous shortcomings if you take away the visual cueing to risk mitigate, and whether or not these are suitable for supporting more expansive UAV ops, including BVLOS UAV transit anywhere near aerodromes. When I took you through the overview of ground risk and air risk earlier in the presentation, I highlighted that an applicant had the option of either accepting the qualitatively allocated assessment of air risk classification, and that flowed through to your SAIL and then onto your TMPRs, or they could go down this somewhat more mysterious path of applying a combination of strategic mitigations and or determining if there was a difference between their general density allocations or an actual localized assessment about how much traffic is in the area and how that worked. So basically what we're going to look at now in the next couple of slides is some of the problems that are still outstanding for the operator and for the regulator, and just give you an idea about where we're going with that in the QM group, but deferring the actual explanation for what we're doing to another slide deck. So a core element within the SORA air risk elements is the combination of ARCs, for which there's only 4, ARC A, B, C and D. And if you don't like those and you don't like the TMPRs that you get, you then have some recourse via the use of airspace encounter categories, which are static, generalized, qualitative representations for the likelihood of an airspace encounter and indicative of a typical environment. Now, I'm not going to go through and systematically decompose each of the elements, but you can see that there's, on the right-hand side, I've listed the assessment metrics, which largely help to partition up the space, and they pertain to what altitude you're at, e.g. above or below 500, whether you're in controlled or not, whether you're overflying a rural area or not, whether you're near a radar, and also what airspace class you are. Now, the use of, I mentioned that the AECs are typical environments, but the use of airspace, especially around airports, may result in something that's more or less dynamic than what the AEC determination qualitatively prescribes. And this is a bit problematic and in some cases may actually be incorrect. Now, in this situation, the applicant may then follow the bouncing ball in a process described in Annex C to demonstrate to the regulator that a lowering of their generalised risk for the local volume is appropriate, but there's some challenges there. So pertaining to the use of Annex C, there's probably 2 core questions that I get asked reasonably consistently, and that is, do the regulators accept that the qualitative AECs and ARC representations represent the actual risk and justify and link in a tangible way to the equipage expectations, particularly since airspace usage patterns vary widely from one aerodrome to the next? And if that is accepted, that is the model is viable, and an applicant is seeking to lower his ARC-AEC combination and therefore TMPR via an improved awareness via airspace characterization of the area that he's looking to operate in, SORA states that they're responsible for producing that airspace characterization. So then the fundamental question is, how would they do this? So in regard to the first question, in 2018, myself and Aaron, who's one of the other members of the working group, and another gentleman, Zi Huang, scrutinised how well the qualitative elements were doing in capturing the real encounter rate around Brisbane. So we looked at all the AECs and cross-compared it with the qualitative definitions to kind of get a feel for numerically what the encounter rates were. And it turns out that there were both over and under estimates. And you know, we reserve judgment on going out to the market and completely saying that's right or wrong, but it does instigate further queries, and that's what we've been doing. And in particular, that's what Aaron and Peter have been focusing on in both Australia and in the US, and to a lesser extent, I've done a bit of work in Singapore. Okay. So the SORA offers up avenues for reducing the raw risk estimates that so that your TMPR load could be reduced. Recall I walked you through that in an earlier section, and these come in the form of strategic mitigations and some additional tactical mitigations that may be deployed. But how this is going to work to support BB loss needs to be fleshed out a little bit. And our focus is, for the moment, is on dealing with methods for establishing more appropriate airspace characterization, i.e. who's going to be there, and trying to do so with a transparent framework that's similar to that provided in Annex F. Now, one of the things to try and craft out what's missing or what needs further clarification on the continuum of the SORA, Annex C, Annex D, and Annex G. Kind of created a flow diagram, and this is just for your benefit. It's more of a queuing thing about what we're doing, and embedded in that, I don't have time to drill into the entire process, but for those of you who want to scrutinize both the left-hand side and then the zoomed-in right-hand side, you'll note that a number of critical processes in the chain of evidence are reliant on the existence of data and airspace characterization, whether it's to demonstrate you're in atypical airspace, or to demonstrate that your local density is different, or to assess the effectiveness and safety of procedural separation and transit corridors. A lot of it is relying on knowledge about airspace traffic. And so that's what we're trying to drill into in the QM group. And like every good scientist, 2 questions gets answered with more questions. And so we've begun looking critically at what's important in terms of data and the techniques that will be suitable, and the differences and the gotchas, so that both the applicants and the regulators will have ready reckoners on what's important, the to-dos and the not-to-dos, so that they're aware of what to look for. For example, if you're looking to capture variability because you want to put a UAV in a particular piece of airspace, but your pre-processing algorithm normalizes all the variation, then obviously that's not a good process, and both regulators and the applicant need to be aware of that. Like I said, this was just a teaser, but for those of you who are interested, I'll be expanding on this via a slide share in the coming weeks. So watch this space if you're keen on seeing what we're up to. Thank you all for your extended attention. I hope you found it useful and interesting, and please feel free to contact me with any questions you may have.